The wealthy cowboy couldn't bear his loneliness. That night, he invited his Apache neighbor in. Jackson Cole had everything a man could dream of. His ranch sprawled across hundreds of acres of Arizona plains, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. The land was dotted with herds of cattle grazing peacefully, fields of golden grass swaying in the wind, and barns and stables that gleamed in the sunlight. He had horses as strong as the mountains, dogs that followed him everywhere, and a home so grand it could almost be called a mansion. Visitors often admired it, neighbors whispered about it, and strangers assumed he was the happiest man alive. But none of them knew the truth. Because Jackson was not happy, not in the way that truly mattered. No matter how many horses he rode, or how much cattle he sold, or how many luxuries he owned, a deep emptiness lingered in his chest. It wasn't the kind of emptiness that could be fixed with money, or a new horse, or a lavish meal. It was the hollow feeling of having no one to share his life with, of waking each morning knowing that the day would pass without a single human voice that truly understood him. He walked through the main house, his boots clicking softly against the polished wooden floor. The walls were decorated with paintings of vast landscapes and framed photographs of ancestors, but they all seemed to stare at him with a quiet judgment. Even surrounded by the weight of history and wealth, Jackson felt small and invisible. The servants greeted him politely. The ranch hands nodded as he passed, but there was no warmth in these interactions. No one asked how he was feeling, no one cared about the quiet ache in his chest, and no one noticed the loneliness that had grown heavier with each passing year. Jackson often found himself wandering the property late in the evening. He would ride his horse along the ridges of the land, watching the sun dip below the horizon and set the sky on fire with orange and purple hues. The wind would whip against his face, and he would close his eyes, letting the sound of rustling grass and distant cattle fill his ears. Sometimes he would talk aloud, telling his horse about his thoughts, his fears, or his memories, as though the animal could respond. Yet even the horses could not replace human companionship. They were loyal, strong, and beautiful, but they did not ask about his day or listen to the quiet loneliness that haunted him. At night, the mansion felt colder than the open plains. The rooms were large and luxurious, with soft carpets, expensive furniture, and glowing fireplaces, but the space only emphasized the absence of anyone to share it with. He would sit alone in the grand dining hall, a single candle flickering on the long table, staring at the empty chair across from him. Dinner tasted like nothing without conversation. Music from the piano in the corner filled the house sometimes, but it could not replace laughter or a voice or a presence that truly belonged to his life. Jackson tried to distract himself with work. He checked the fences, inspected the cattle, rode long distances to ensure nothing was wrong with his land. He spent hours tending to the barns, making sure the horses were well fed and the fields were maintained. Outsiders would have said he was a man of action, a hard-working rancher, a man in control of everything around him. But inside, he felt powerless. The routine of labor could not erase the gnawing feeling of solitude. Even when he slept, the silence of the house seemed to press down on him, and he would wake in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, wishing for someone to sit beside him and share the quiet darkness. He remembered, sometimes, the early years of his life. As a child, the ranch had been alive with voices. His parents, his siblings, neighbors, and friends who ran across the fields without a care. Those were the days when the nights were filled with laughter around the fireplace, when stories were shared over simple meals, and when companionship felt natural and abundant. But over the years, one by one, those people had moved away, passed on, or grown distant. The ranch had grown bigger, the wealth had grown more abundant, but the human warmth had faded into memory. The emptiness he felt now was more than loneliness. It was the weight of years without connection, the ache of realizing that life could be full of everything material, yet hollow at its core. One evening, as the sky turned shades of deep indigo and the first stars began to appear, Jackson sat on the veranda overlooking the land. The wind carried the faint smell of wet grass from a distant rainstorm, and the silhouettes of horses moved across the fields like shadows. He had spent the day checking the fences, repairing a broken gate, and tending to a sick calf, yet the work had done nothing to lift the heaviness inside him. He felt the silence pressing in, a reminder that no matter how much he owned, no matter how successful he appeared, he was utterly alone. For the first time in years, he felt a longing that went beyond comfort or wealth. It was a deep, urgent need to connect with another human being, to hear a voice that was not polite or distant, to share stories and laughter without caution. He realized that all his riches, his possessions, and his accomplishments could not fill the space inside him. The walls of his mansion were impressive, but they were also barriers, echoing the sound of his own thoughts back at him, reinforcing the isolation he had tried to ignore. Jackson thought about his neighbors. There were few close enough to call friends, and even fewer he truly understood. One neighbor in particular came to mind, Tay, an Apache man who lived several miles away on the edge of the plains. They had exchanged polite greetings over the years, nods at the fences, and small talk when they happened to meet in town. But they had never really spoken, never shared a meal, never had a conversation that went beyond the ordinary. Yet something about Tay's quiet strength and grounded presence had always drawn Jackson in. He had watched Tay ride his horse with skill and ease, noticed the way he tended to his land with care, and respected the wisdom in his eyes. In that moment, Jackson realized that he wanted more than polite nods. He wanted true human connection. The wind picked up as night fully settled over the ranch. Stars twinkled faintly above the vast plains, and the distant howl of coyotes added to the eerie quiet. Jackson felt a sudden urgency. He did not want another night of emptiness, of staring at the fireplace alone, of feeling the cold distance of wealth without warmth. He wanted conversation, laughter, understanding, and the simple comfort of having someone in the same room. He wanted a presence that could remind him he was more than a man surrounded by possessions. He was a man capable of friendship, capable of connection, capable of being seen. With that thought, he made a decision. It was unusual, bold even. He would invite Tay over. He did not know how the offer would be received. He did not know if it would feel awkward or strange. But he knew that staying alone was no longer an option. Jackson dressed warmly, grabbed his hat, and walked out into the night. His boots sank slightly into the soft earth, the air was crisp, and the scent of wet grass and distant rain filled his lungs. He mounted his horse and began the ride toward Tay's home, feeling a mix of nervousness and hope. As he approached the neighbor's house, Jackson felt the weight of years of isolation pressing on him. Tay's door opened, and there he was, calm, observant, and quietly strong. Jackson's words stumbled at first, but his meaning was clear. He wanted company, he wanted conversation, and he wanted someone to share the night with. Tay studied him carefully, and then, with a small but genuine smile, nodded. There was no judgment, no hesitation, just the simple recognition that Jackson's loneliness was real and honest. And so, that night, Jackson Cole took a step he had never taken before. He invited another human being into his life, into his home, and into his heart. He did not know what the evening would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The emptiness that had haunted him for years seemed slightly less heavy, and the prospect of connection filled him with a quiet excitement he had long forgotten. As he led Tay toward the ranch, Jackson felt the wind on his face and the stars overhead, and he realized that sometimes the bravest thing a man could do was simply reach out. That night, amidst the vast plains, the sprawling land, and the silent wealth that surrounded him, Jackson was ready to confront his loneliness. and perhaps, in doing so, find something far more valuable than gold, true companionship. Jackson led Tay across the open plains under the faint light of the moon. The land was quiet except for the occasional rustle of grass and the distant cry of a night bird. The storm from earlier had passed, leaving the earth damp and fragrant with the scent of rain. Jackson's horse moved steadily, carrying them both through the fields, while Tay rode silently beside him, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he were taking in every detail of the vast ranch. Jackson could feel the tension in his own chest slowly easing. The nervousness of inviting Tay over, of crossing the invisible boundary that had always existed between them, was giving way to something new, hope. He had respected Tay for years, admired the quiet strength and resilience that seemed to flow naturally from him. Now, riding together in the still night, Jackson realized that admiration was not enough. He needed human connection, someone to share stories, someone to understand his loneliness. And somehow, he felt that Tay could do that. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, it was thoughtful. Sometimes words were unnecessary. Jackson found himself observing Tay in a new way. The calm way he held the reins, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the way his eyes seemed to see not just the land but everything upon it. There was wisdom there, born from years of experience, patience, and a deep understanding of life that Jackson felt he lacked. It was humbling and reassuring at the same time. When they reached the ranch house, Jackson paused at the gate, taking a deep breath. The mansion loomed before them, lit by the soft glow of lanterns and the faint flicker of firelight from the windows. Inside, the house looked vast, almost intimidating, but Jackson was determined to make the evening a warm and welcoming one. He wanted Tay to feel at ease, to see beyond the grandeur and recognize that Jackson's invitation came from genuine need, not pride or obligation. As they entered the house, the warmth of the fireplace greeted them. The scent of polished wood and faintly burned logs filled the air. Jackson gestured toward the living room, where a pair of chairs had been placed near the fire. Tay's eyes lingered on the room, taking in the paintings, the furniture, and the orderly layout, but there was no sign of intimidation. Instead, there was curiosity, a quiet awareness that seemed to respect both the space and the man who had created it. Jackson offered Tay a drink, something simple but comforting, a cup of hot coffee that steamed in the cool air of the room. He watched as Tay accepted it with a nod, his hand steady as he held the cup. For a moment, Jackson felt unsure of what to say. Words seemed inadequate after years of isolation, after months of longing for connection that had gone unfulfilled. But Tay did not rush him. He simply waited, patient, allowing Jackson to gather his thoughts. Finally, Jackson spoke. His voice was low, almost hesitant, but it carried the weight of honesty. I don't usually do this," he admitted, glancing at Tay. "I don't often invite people over not like this. But tonight I couldn't be alone. I thought maybe we could share some company." Tay regarded him for a long moment. There was no mockery, no judgment, only understanding. He set his cup down carefully and nodded. "You're welcome here," he said simply. "Sometimes we all need company, even if we've never met properly." The simplicity of the words, so matter-of-fact yet sincere, brought a strange relief to Jackson. He had imagined awkwardness, silence, or even refusal, but none of that happened. Instead, he felt the first real connection he had known in a long time. It was unspoken, gentle, and powerful. The distance that had existed between them, shaped by years of polite nods, assumptions, and quiet observation, began to dissolve. They settled into the chairs by the fire, the warm glow illuminating their faces. Outside, the plain stretched endlessly, but inside, the room felt intimate and safe. Jackson realized that it was not the grandeur of his home that mattered. It was the presence of another human being, the acknowledgement that he was seen, and that his loneliness was understood. For the first time in years, he felt truly at ease. Conversation began slowly, cautiously. Jackson shared stories of his daily life on the ranch, the early mornings feeding cattle, the long rides across the plains, the occasional mishap with horses or fences. Tay listened intently, occasionally asking questions, never interrupting and never seeming bored. His attention was steady, his interest genuine. Jackson felt a spark of relief and joy that he had not felt in years. When it was Tay's turn, he spoke of his own experiences. He told stories of the land he cared for, of his family and heritage, of the lessons he had learned from his ancestors. There was a rhythm to his words, a natural storytelling that captivated Jackson. He spoke not only of the practicalities of life, but of its deeper meaning, the importance of patience, resilience, and respect for the world around him. Jackson listened, absorbing each story, each lesson, feeling his own understanding of life broaden and deepen. Hours passed without them noticing. The fire dwindled to glowing embers, but the warmth in the room had grown. They laughed over small memories, exchanged thoughts about the land and the people around them, and reflected on the peculiar loneliness that sometimes accompanies wealth or independence. Jackson spoke of his longing for human connection, of nights spent alone with only the wind and the stars. Tay nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words without judgment, sharing similar experiences of isolation and the subtle barriers that can separate people even when they live close together. Through the conversation, Jackson began to realize something profound. The emptiness he had carried for years was not simply about being alone. It was about the absence of meaningful human interaction. He had been surrounded by wealth, by comfort, by the trappings of a successful life, yet none of it had mattered without someone to share it with. Tay's presence, his attentiveness, and his willingness to simply be there made Jackson feel alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. There was also a moment of shared silence, where neither man spoke. The fire crackled, casting shadows across the room, and Jackson felt the comfort of simply existing alongside someone who understood, without the need for words. It was a rare gift, one that he had forgotten could exist in a world that often values wealth over warmth. In that silence, he realized that connection was not forced, not transactional, and not bound by culture or background. It was simply human. Tay, too, seemed affected by the evening. He had lived with independence, with careful boundaries, and with the knowledge that trust is earned slowly. Yet, in Jackson's honesty, he saw something worth responding to, a man who dared to admit vulnerability, who reached beyond isolation to seek friendship. Tay felt a quiet respect for Jackson, not for his wealth or his home, but for his courage in facing loneliness and asking for companionship. As the night deepened, Jackson offered a simple meal, bread, cheese, and some roasted vegetables he had prepared earlier. They ate together, still talking, sharing thoughts about the land, the animals, and the challenges of life. The simplicity of the meal, paired with genuine conversation, created a warmth that no luxury could match. Jackson realized that nights like this were priceless, and that connection was the wealth he had truly been missing all these years. Eventually, the conversation shifted to dreams and hopes. Jackson shared his wish for a life where he could belong, where he could be more than a solitary figure on a vast ranch. Tay spoke of his desire for understanding between people, for breaking down barriers of fear or misunderstanding, and for finding moments of genuine friendship in unexpected places. They found that their hopes were not so different, that despite differences in background, culture, and experience, there were universal human desires that bound them together. By the time the embers of the fire began to die, a quiet bond had formed. It was subtle, not loud or declared, but strong and real. Jackson no longer felt the crushing weight of loneliness pressing on him. Tay no longer felt the distance that had once existed between him and the world of wealth and privilege. They had crossed the invisible boundaries that had separated them for years, and in doing so, had created something rare, a shared human connection born of honesty, courage, and the willingness to reach out. Before Tay left to return home for the night, Jackson walked him to the door. The plains outside were still, bathed in moonlight, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of damp earth. Jackson felt a gratitude he could not put into words. He had invited someone in not out of obligation, not out of pride, but out of need, and the result had been far greater than he had imagined. Tay looked at him and smiled. "You're not so alone, Jackson," he said simply. "Sometimes all it takes is one night, one conversation, one shared moment to change everything." Jackson nodded, feeling the truth of the words settle in his heart. As Tay rode back across the plains, Jackson returned inside, feeling lighter than he had in years. The house no longer felt empty. It felt alive with possibility. He knew that this night was only the beginning, that there would be more conversations, more shared stories, and perhaps a lasting friendship that would bring warmth to both their lives. For Jackson Cole, the wealthy cowboy who had once believed that possessions could fill the emptiness inside, the night had revealed a simple truth. Human connection, honesty, and courage to reach out were worth far more than any treasure the land could provide. And for Tay, the quiet Apache neighbor, the night had shown that friendship could be found in the most unexpected places, bridging worlds and hearts with nothing more than willingness and understanding. The next morning, Jackson woke with a strange lightness in his chest. For the first time in months, he did not feel the heavy weight of isolation pressing down on him. The sun was just rising over the plains, casting golden streaks across the land, and the sound of the wind moving through the tall grass seemed almost musical. Jackson stretched, feeling the cool air of the early morning fill his lungs, and thought about the night before. Tay's presence, his calm voice, and the quiet understanding that had passed between them felt like a lifeline. Breakfast was simple, just coffee and bread, but the mood was entirely different. When Tay arrived at the ranch again that morning, this time by invitation rather than necessity, they both felt a sense of ease. There was no tension, no hesitation. It was as if a bridge had been built overnight, connecting two men from very different worlds. Jackson greeted him warmly, and Tay returned the gesture with a small smile, a recognition that their connection was real and valuable. They began their morning together by walking through the stables. Jackson introduced Tay to each horse, explaining the animal's temperaments, quirks, and routines. Tay listened intently, occasionally offering advice on handling them. His experience with horses was evident, and Jackson found himself learning from Tay's quiet knowledge. The way Tay approached the animals, with patience, care, and calm confidence, impressed Jackson. It was a reminder that wisdom often came from observation and experience rather than wealth or status. After the horses, they moved on to inspect the fences and fields. Jackson had always been meticulous about his land, but with Tay's help, he saw details he had overlooked. Tay pointed out patches of grass that needed attention, weak posts that could break under wind, and small areas where water could gather after a storm. Jackson appreciated the insight, not just because it helped maintain the ranch, but because it represented something deeper, the willingness of another person to share knowledge, to be present, and to help without judgment or expectation. As the day warmed, the two men sat under the shade of a lone mesquite tree, eating a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and fruit. The conversation drifted from practical matters to more personal stories. Tay spoke of his youth, the lessons he had learned from his family, and the challenges of living in a world that often misunderstood him. Jackson shared memories of his childhood on the ranch, the stories his parents had told him, and the pressures of carrying on a family legacy. With each story, the men found common ground, discovering that despite different backgrounds, they shared similar hopes, fears, and dreams. Jackson realized that this was something he had never experienced before. A conversation where silence was comfortable, where words were meaningful, and where listening mattered as much as speaking. He had spent years surrounded by people who spoke for the sake of speaking, who laughed without understanding, and who assumed that wealth and land were all that defined him. But with Tay, Jackson felt seen and understood. It was a profound relief, a feeling that filled the emptiness he had carried for so long. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, they decided to take a ride across the open plains. Jackson's horse and Tay's moved side by side, kicking up dust as they rode. The landscape stretched endlessly, and for the first time, Jackson noticed the beauty of it in a way that had nothing to do with ownership or responsibility. He saw the patterns in the grass, the play of sunlight on distant hills, and the way the wind bent the branches of trees. Riding beside Tay, he felt a sense of companionship that made the vastness of the plains feel less lonely. They stopped by a small creek that ran through the property. The water was clear, reflecting the sky above, and the gentle sound of flowing water was calming. Jackson removed his hat and ran his hand through the cool water, while Tay knelt beside him, observing the way the creek cut through the land. Tay spoke about the importance of water in the plains, not just for survival but for life itself. He explained how understanding the land, its rivers, and its cycles was a form of respect for nature. Jackson listened carefully, realizing that Tay's perspective was both practical and spiritual. It reminded him that life was about more than wealth. It was about connection, respect, and balance. After a while, they sat on the bank, their feet dangling in the water, and continued to talk. Tay shared stories from his childhood, running across hills, learning from elders, and observing the world with curiosity and care. Jackson responded with tales of his own experiences, of the long days on the ranch, and the quiet moments when he had felt most alive. There was laughter, thoughtful silence, and the occasional shared smile. Jackson felt something shift inside him. The bond they had begun to form the night before was growing stronger, built on trust, honesty, and mutual respect. As the afternoon wore on, Jackson invited Tay back to the house for a short rest. The ranch had become a place of shared space, no longer a symbol of isolation. Inside, they sat by the fire again, sipping water and letting the warmth seep into their bodies. Jackson noticed how natural it felt to have Tay there, how the house no longer seemed empty, and how the silence was now comfortable rather than oppressive. He realized that friendship, when genuine, could transform even the grandest, loneliest spaces into places of warmth. The conversation that evening turned to dreams and fears. Jackson admitted that he had often wondered if his life would always be this lonely, despite the wealth and beauty around him. Tay spoke of his own fears, of being misunderstood, of the barriers that existed between people of different worlds, and of the courage required to reach out. Both men realized that their fears were not so different. They laughed at the irony that two men from such different backgrounds could find so much in common, and yet it made sense. They were both human, seeking connection and understanding in a world that often seemed indifferent. As night fell, Jackson cooked a simple dinner for them both. It was modest, bread, roasted vegetables, and some meat from the ranch, but it was filled with warmth and care. They ate slowly, savoring the food and the presence of each other. Conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from the routines of the ranch to the small joys of life that were often overlooked. Jackson noticed how rare it was to have someone sit across from him who truly listened, who responded thoughtfully, and who shared in the quiet joy of ordinary moments. After dinner, they returned to the fire. Jackson picked up his guitar, an old instrument he had rarely played, and strummed a few simple chords. Tay listened, nodding along with the rhythm, and eventually shared a song from his own heritage, humming softly as the firelight danced on the walls. Music, stories, and laughter filled the house, transforming it from a mansion of solitude into a home of shared experience. Jackson realized that moments like these, moments of genuine human connection, were priceless, far more valuable than any wealth or land could ever be. Later, as the fire burned low, they sat in silence again, simply enjoying each other's company. Jackson felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. The loneliness that had once defined his life had been replaced with the quiet joy of friendship, with the understanding that reaching out could create bonds stronger than wealth, stronger than pride, stronger than fear. He looked at Tay, seeing not just a neighbor but a companion, a teacher, and a friend. Tay, too, seemed changed by the day. He had entered the ranch as a polite neighbor, unsure of what to expect, but he left with a sense of connection and belonging. He had witnessed the courage it took for Jackson to invite him in, and he had responded in kind with honesty and openness. Together, they had created a space where differences were respected, where stories were shared, and where human connection was celebrated. Before Tay finally left for the night, they stood on the veranda, looking out at the plains under the stars. The wind was gentle, the world quiet, and the air carried the faint scent of earth and grass. Jackson felt a gratitude that he could not fully express in words. He had invited someone in, and in doing so, he had discovered something far richer than gold, far more enduring than land: friendship, trust, and the warmth of shared human experience. As Tay rode back across the plains, Jackson returned inside, feeling lighter than he had in years. The house no longer felt cold or empty. It felt alive, filled with the promise of future conversations, shared experiences, and the comfort of knowing that he was not truly alone. He realized that sometimes the bravest act a person could take was simply to reach out, to invite another human being into their life, and to allow the possibility of connection to flourish. That night, Jackson sat by the fire long after Tay had gone. He reflected on the day, on the bond that had grown between them, and on the profound lessons he had learned. Friendship, he realized, was not about wealth, status, or appearances. It was about honesty, presence, and the courage to be vulnerable. And in that moment, Jackson knew that his life, once defined by loneliness, had begun to change in ways he could never have imagined. Morning arrived over the Arizona plains with a soft golden light that spread across Jackson Cole's vast ranch. The wind moved gently through the fields, carrying the scent of wet grass and distant earth. Jackson rose from his bed feeling lighter than he had in years. The past nights had changed something deep inside him, and he could feel it in every step he took. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the ranch, which had once seemed enormous and lonely, felt alive, not just because of the land and the animals, but because of human connection. Tay, his Apache neighbor and newfound friend, had already arrived outside, waiting patiently. There was no formality, no hesitation, just the quiet understanding of two men who had crossed a boundary and found something rare: genuine friendship. Jackson stepped outside, the cool morning air brushing his face, and Tay gave him a small, respectful nod. It was not just a greeting, it was a recognition of the bond they had begun to form. They started their day together by walking the fields, inspecting fences, and checking the cattle. Tay's keen eyes noticed things Jackson had overlooked, and Jackson found himself grateful not only for the assistance, but for the presence of someone who cared enough to observe, to point things out, and to engage with him. The conversation was easy, filled with laughter and shared observations about the land, animals, and life itself. Jackson realized that this was more than help, it was companionship, and it was something he had missed far too long. After a few hours of work, they took a break under the shade of a mesquite tree near the creek. Jackson offered Tay a simple breakfast of bread, fruit, and roasted coffee. They sat side by side, legs stretched toward the flowing water, and spoke of life beyond the ranch. Jackson admitted to Tay that despite wealth, he had often felt like a stranger to the world, isolated by the very success he had achieved. Tay, in his calm, thoughtful manner, nodded and shared that he too had felt isolation, not because of wealth, but because of boundaries people often built around culture, history, and misunderstanding. It was a revelation for Jackson to see that their experiences, though shaped by different circumstances, shared a common thread. Both men had felt alone, misunderstood, and cut off from those around them. Yet now, through a single act of reaching out, they had discovered the simple but powerful truth that connection was possible, even between worlds that had seemed separate for generations. By midday, they decided to ride across the plains together. The land stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of gold and green under the sun. Jackson and Tay rode side by side, the horses' hooves kicking up dust, the wind carrying the sound across the open fields. They spoke little at first, content with shared presence, but soon conversation resumed naturally. Jackson told stories of his family history, of challenges and triumphs on the ranch, of nights when he had felt lonely despite the grandeur around him. Tay responded with tales of his heritage, the lessons his elders had taught him, and the ways he had learned to navigate a world often unkind to those who were different. Jackson listened intently, fascinated not only by the stories but by the wisdom they contained. He realized that Tay's perspective had a depth that came from observing life carefully and valuing the connections that mattered most. In turn, Tay found Jackson's openness refreshing. Here was a man who had always seemed distant, perhaps even unapproachable, yet who was capable of deep reflection and honest emotion. As the sun reached its highest point, they stopped near a small grove of trees where the grass was soft and the shade inviting. They shared a quiet lunch, enjoying the breeze and the sound of a nearby creek. Conversation flowed naturally, moving from practical matters to dreams, fears, and the simple joys of life. Jackson felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with food or sun, but with the presence of someone who understood him without judgment. He realized that this kind of companionship was rare and precious, something far more valuable than the land or the riches he had spent a lifetime accumulating. After lunch, Jackson suggested they try something different, exploring the hills beyond the ranch. The terrain was rougher, the paths less familiar, but Tay welcomed the challenge. They rode together, navigating narrow trails and rocky slopes, sharing laughter when a horse stumbled slightly or when Jackson lost his balance. These moments of lightness, combined with the deep conversations of the morning, created a bond that was no longer fragile. They were discovering not just friendship, but trust, understanding, and the joy of shared experiences. As the afternoon wore on, they reached the top of a hill that offered a breathtaking view of the plains. The horizon stretched endlessly, dotted with cattle, streams, and the soft curves of distant hills. Jackson stopped, letting his horse breathe, and looked out over the land. For the first time, he did not feel a sense of ownership or responsibility weighing him down. Instead, he felt awe, gratitude, and a connection to the world that was not rooted in wealth, but in presence. Tay stood beside him, silent, sharing the view. No words were needed. The quiet understanding between them spoke volumes. Returning to the ranch as the sun began to lower, they worked together to repair fences that had been weakened by the recent storm. The physical labor was satisfying, but the real fulfillment came from collaboration, the shared effort, and the easy camaraderie that had grown between them. Jackson realized that he had spent too many years isolating himself, believing that he must manage everything alone. Now he saw the value of allowing others in, of sharing responsibilities, and of embracing the joy that comes from partnership and friendship. Evening approached, bringing with it the soft colors of sunset. Jackson and Tay sat by the fire, as they had done the previous nights. This time the firelight seemed brighter, warmer, not just because of the flames, but because of the bond that had grown between them. Jackson picked up his guitar and strummed gently, while Tay hummed along with a song from his heritage. Music, storytelling, and shared laughter created a feeling of home that transcended the physical space of the mansion. The house no longer felt like a lonely fortress. It felt alive, a place where connection and understanding could flourish. They talked long into the night, discussing hopes for the future. Jackson admitted that he had longed for friendship, for someone to share life's small and big moments with. Tay spoke of his own dreams for understanding, connection, and breaking barriers between people. They realized that despite differences in upbringing and culture, their hearts and hopes were similar. The night was filled with reflection, laughter, and the comfort of knowing they had found something rare: mutual respect, understanding, and companionship. Before Tay left to return to his home, Jackson walked him to the edge of the ranch. The stars shone brightly overhead, the wind whispered through the trees, and the plains stretched endlessly. Jackson felt a profound gratitude. He had invited someone in not for appearance, obligation, or status, but because of honest need, and the result had been beyond anything he had imagined. Tay's presence had brought warmth, wisdom, and a sense of belonging that Jackson had not experienced in years. Tay looked back at Jackson with a quiet smile. "You've made a place here, Jackson, not just for yourself but for friendship. That matters more than anything else." Jackson nodded, understanding the weight of the words. He had learned that wealth and land could provide comfort, but human connection brought life, meaning, and joy. As Tay rode home, Jackson returned to the mansion, feeling a sense of peace that was almost new to him. The ranch, once vast and lonely, now felt like a place of possibilities, a home where laughter, stories, and shared moments could flourish. He realized that the nights spent alone, staring at the fireplace, had been replaced by nights filled with warmth, learning, and friendship. The transformation was not about grandeur or possessions. It was about courage, openness, and the simple act of inviting another human being in. Jackson reflected on the lessons of the past days. He had discovered that true wealth was not measured by land, cattle, or money, but by the depth of human relationships. Friendship could cross boundaries, heal loneliness, and create spaces of trust and understanding. He also realized that reaching out, being vulnerable, and embracing connection required courage, but the rewards were immeasurable. Over the following weeks, Jackson and Tay's bond grew stronger. They worked together on the ranch, shared meals, told stories, and spent hours exploring the plains. Their friendship became a source of joy, teaching Jackson the value of humility, patience, and the simple pleasures of life. Tay, too, found fulfillment in the companionship, the shared work, and the trust that Jackson had offered. Together, they created a space where differences were respected, where conversation and laughter flourished, and where the plains no longer felt endless and lonely. The story of their friendship gradually became known to the local community. Neighbors and townsfolk noticed the change in Jackson, the warmth in his voice, the lightness in his step, and the joy that now radiated from him. Some were curious, some were inspired, and many were reminded that true connection could transform lives in ways that wealth and status never could. Jackson and Tay never sought attention. They simply continued to cultivate their friendship, knowing that it was the most valuable treasure they had discovered. One evening, after a long day of work and conversation, Jackson sat by the fire and thought about the journey of the past days. The lonely nights, the emptiness that had weighed him down, and the fear of reaching out all seemed distant now. He had learned that sometimes, the bravest and most rewarding act a person can take is to open their life to someone else, to invite them in, and to embrace the possibility of connection. And in doing so, Jackson had found something far richer than land, cattle, or gold. He had found friendship, understanding, and the quiet happiness that comes from being truly seen. Months passed, and life on Jackson Cole's ranch began to feel remarkably different. The loneliness that had once hung over the mansion like a shadow had all but vanished. Every morning, Jackson woke to the sound of his horses, the calls of birds, and now, the steady presence of Tay. The Apache neighbor had become a part of the rhythm of the ranch, not as a guest, but as a true friend, someone who shared in work, stories, and life itself. Jackson noticed small changes in himself. He no longer dreaded the quiet nights, for he knew there would be companionship to fill them. Even simple tasks, feeding the horses, repairing fences, or walking through the fields, were now infused with joy. Conversation with Tay was effortless, full of laughter, reflection, and mutual understanding. Jackson realized that the richness of life was not in land, wealth, or cattle, but in the shared experiences that made each day meaningful. The two men developed a routine that was as natural as the rising sun. Mornings began with work on the ranch, checking fences, tending to the fields, and making sure the cattle were healthy. Tay's knowledge of the land was invaluable. He understood subtle signs in the grass, the water, and the animals that Jackson had never noticed. In turn, Jackson shared the lessons he had learned over years of ranching. Their skills complemented each other, and the work became not just labor, but a collaboration filled with respect and trust. Evenings became a sacred time for conversation. They would sit by the fire, sometimes quietly listening to the crackling flames, sometimes sharing stories that stretched back generations. Tay would hum soft songs from his heritage, and Jackson would strum his guitar, creating a harmony that filled the room with warmth and life. These nights were no longer about loneliness or obligation. They were about connection, learning, and the joy of being seen by another human being. One afternoon, Jackson suggested they take a longer ride into the hills beyond the ranch. The terrain was rugged, with rocky slopes and narrow paths, but both men welcomed the challenge. Riding side by side, they spoke about the future, dreams, and the small details of life that often go unnoticed. Jackson shared stories from his childhood, of the lessons he had learned from his parents, and the mistakes he had made along the way. Tay responded with tales of his own life, the wisdom he had gained from observing nature, and the values that guided him. As they reached a high ridge, the view of the plains below was breathtaking. The sunlight painted the landscape in golden hues, and Jackson felt a profound sense of gratitude. It was in these quiet moments, high above the world, that he understood the true meaning of friendship. It was not about words or gifts, not about appearances or status. It was about presence, trust, and the courage to reach out and let someone in. Tay, standing beside him, seemed to feel the same, their silence speaking louder than any words could. Over the weeks, the friendship deepened. They shared meals, repaired barns, and even worked together to plant a small vegetable garden near the house. Each activity, no matter how simple, became an opportunity to learn, teach, and connect. Jackson noticed that Tay had a way of seeing the world that made him notice things he had overlooked for years. The beauty of a single tree, the patterns of birds flying across the sky, or the delicate balance of the creek as it wound through the fields. Jackson realized that friendship could be a teacher as well as a comfort. Their bond extended beyond work and daily routines. They began to discuss broader ideas, ethics, community, and the importance of kindness. Tay spoke of the values passed down through his family and culture, respect for the land, empathy for others, and the quiet courage to face life with integrity. Jackson listened, absorbing not just the words but the spirit behind them. He found himself reflecting more deeply on his own choices, on the way he treated others, and on the legacy he wished to leave behind. One evening, after a long day of tending to the fields, they sat by the fire, the sky outside painted in shades of pink and purple. Jackson noticed how different he felt now compared to months ago. The ache of loneliness was gone, replaced with warmth, purpose, and connection. Tay shared a story about a lesson from his grandfather, about the importance of seeing value in every day and in every person. Jackson nodded, realizing that the lesson applied to him. He had been so focused on wealth and work that he had forgotten the simplest, most rewarding part of life, being present with another human being. Word of their friendship began to reach the local community. Neighbors and townsfolk noticed the change in Jackson. He smiled more, spoke kindly to everyone, and seemed lighter, almost unburdened. People were curious, some inspired, but none could fully understand what had truly transformed him. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't power. It was the quiet friendship he had cultivated with Tay, a bond that bridged differences and created a space of understanding, respect, and shared experience. The seasons began to change, and with each shift, Jackson and Tay found new ways to explore the land and enjoy life together. In the spring, they worked to plant new crops, ensuring that the ranch would continue to thrive. In the summer, they rode the plains together in the early mornings, enjoying the warmth of the sun and the freedom of open space. In the fall, they collected firewood and prepared for the colder nights, sharing stories by the fire that grew longer as the nights stretched. And in the winter, they repaired fences and shelters, laughing at small mistakes and enjoying the quiet beauty of the land dusted with frost. Through all of this, Jackson realized a profound truth. Life's greatest treasures were not gold, land, or cattle, but human connection. Tay had taught him patience, humility, and the value of listening. Jackson, in turn, had given Tay a space to share his knowledge, his culture, and his experiences. Together, they had created something rare, a partnership that was not just about work or convenience, but about trust, respect, and mutual care. One evening, as the sun set and painted the plains in deep shades of orange and red, Jackson and Tay sat atop a hill overlooking the ranch. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the soft scent of earth and distant flowers. Jackson spoke quietly, reflecting on how different life had been just months ago. He had once believed that wealth could fill the emptiness in his heart, that the grand house and vast land could replace the warmth of human connection. Now, he understood how mistaken he had been. True fulfillment came not from possession, but from companionship, shared experience, and the courage to open oneself to another. Tay nodded thoughtfully. "The land is important," he said softly, "but it is the people we share it with that give it meaning." Jackson smiled, realizing how perfectly Tay had summed up the lessons of their time together. It was not just the work they had done or the stories they had shared. It was the bond they had formed, the trust they had built, and the moments of understanding that would last a lifetime. The months continued to pass, each day reinforcing their friendship. Jackson began inviting other neighbors and friends to the ranch, slowly building a small community that shared in the land, in work, and in stories. Tay was always by his side, a bridge between different worlds, cultures, and perspectives. Together, they demonstrated that connection could overcome distance, isolation, and even years of solitude. Jackson's nights were no longer lonely. The fireplace glowed with warmth, laughter filled the room, and the house resonated with the presence of life and friendship. He found joy in simple things, sharing a cup of coffee with Tay in the morning, listening to the wind through the trees, and watching the sun rise over the plains. The emptiness that had once defined his life was replaced with a sense of purpose, gratitude, and the profound comfort of knowing he was not alone. Tay, too, experienced a transformation. He had always valued independence and self-reliance, yet he now understood the richness of companionship. The quiet strength he had always carried found a new dimension in friendship, the ability to trust, to share, and to embrace moments of joy with someone who truly understood. Together, they had built a partnership that was deeper than work, beyond convenience, and richer than any material wealth. In the quiet moments of reflection, Jackson realized that his journey had been more than a personal transformation. It was a lesson in humanity, in courage, and in the extraordinary power of friendship. He had learned that even the wealthiest man could feel empty without human connection, and that one act of reaching out, one invitation, one moment of honesty could change a life forever. Tay had taught him that differences in background or culture were not barriers, but opportunities to learn, grow, and find shared meaning. By the time the year came full circle, Jackson and Tay's friendship had become a foundation for the entire ranch. They worked, laughed, and explored together, supporting one another through the challenges and joys of daily life. The mansion that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with the warmth of companionship, the joy of shared experience, and the quiet, enduring beauty of friendship. On one particularly clear night, they sat outside beneath the stars, the plains stretching endlessly around them. Jackson looked at Tay, seeing not just a neighbor but a brother in spirit, a companion who had transformed his life, and a teacher who had shown him the value of presence, courage, and trust. He realized that the wealth he had once prized, land, horses, cattle, was meaningless without the simple, profound connection he had found. Tay, looking out at the horizon, added softly, "Life is richer when shared. The land, the work, the stories, they are only complete when there is someone to share them with." Jackson nodded, understanding that this truth had always been there, waiting to be discovered. That night under the endless stars, Jackson knew he had found the greatest treasure of all, lasting friendship, shared experiences, and a life filled with meaning.